Okay, in part two of this week's topic, I'm looking at youth cultures. So, plainly, youth culture is just the culture of young people, the things that they do in their day-to-day lives. Youth culture here relates to more kind of leisure activities, rather than youth transitions tends to look at the more educational and work and relationship side of life. Youth culture is more about leisure and creativity and consumption. So it's one distinction to make between the things, although it's really important to not just make too much distinction between those things because they obviously interrelate. So the study of youth culture, particularly from the Chicago School in the 50s around deviance and then from the Birmingham School in the 60s and 70s, kind of points out that at least then, and it's probably the same now but not as much, that young people don't necessarily go to the same places, listen to the same music, wear the same clothes, do the same stuff as older people. Traditionally, there was kind of the stuff that people did as they were young, and then you kind of grow up and do this other stuff. So the idea that young people have their own leisure pursuits, unique relationship with their own peers, particularly today with social media and all that kind of thing. So those kind of generational trajectories are still accurate, I think. You can even kind of read them onto social media technologies. I'm in my mid-40s. I'm kind of understanding of things like Facebook and Twitter, but not so much with, TikTok or whatever. Those kind of much more youth practices now. But there's also some really interesting research since the 80s and 90s done by people like Andy Bennett and Paul Hodgkinson that say there isn't maybe as much separation between youth culture and, older adult culture today, that some, adults don't necessarily stop doing the things they were doing when they were young. They just might do them differently. The research that they showed was like about, punks getting older and, maybe still going to gigs, but, standing up the back and, leaning on things rather than being down at the front and, jumping up and down in a mosh or whatever. But in terms of youth culture itself, there's kind of, like any of these cultural things, there's class, gender, race and ethnicity kind of distinctions are going on in them. So there's subdivisions within youth culture. So it's important here to think about youth culture in this just one amorphous thing. It kind of, in many ways, reproduces broader contours of inequality in society. But, it does kind of have connections to particular, generations. Locality is quite important in terms of youth culture. So again, something like punk over the years, it kind of started in places like New York and London will kind of then spring up in different other cities and towns or whatever. It has its own scene there, but then they'll have their own kind of local things that come into that differentiate them as well. So, we can see how this relates to notions of habitus, that, people's socialization will expose them and see them take part and practice in different types of youth cultures. So why study youth culture? Well, it's seen as kind of relating back to the socialization stuff. It's a real key site of kind of secondary socialization, as we move primary, the home, in your immediate family, as you move out into the world at family and school, start meeting other people that may or may not be like you, have similar tastes. You kind of start forming social groups with those people. So youth culture is a kind of way where identity is developed and people develop tastes and orientations to the world and things like that. Youth cultures can be a place where, in the conformity of school, people have an opportunity to have some agency or autonomy to become someone, to do their own thing, to feel like they belong to things. They often to allow people to feel a little bit safe, both in terms of the confusing nature of pop culture and pseudo-individualization that we've looked at in the course, but also particularly the way subcultural analysis comes to understand alternative and kind of resistive forms of youth cultures. They become a bit of a refuge for people that are kind of, not accepted, not the emphasized femininity or the hegemonic masculinity people say at school. They're kind of these other forms of kind of masculinity or femininity. They're not necessarily popular, they don't fit in, and they can find other kind of subcultural areas to kind of fit in and find people like them. So youth cultures, very broadly, are kind of ways that people experience sociality, meet friends and sexual partners, and develop relationships. It allows them some kind of refuge sometimes from the pressures of school and parents and family, and allows them to kind of maybe have some kind of safe space when it comes to mental health, and things like alienation and anatomy that we've been looking at in the course as well. The subcultures that have been kind of prominently studied tend to be the more spectacular and resistant ones. Again, things like punk and goth and riot girl and stuff like that. And it's shown that like these are ways for young people to express resistance to dominant norms, and do so through fashion and various ritualistic things. So these ideas, we've mentioned these in the course already, come from the Birmingham School. We've also looked at the Frankfurt School in the course. Both of these kind of ways of thinking about consumer and youth culture are influenced by Marx. But they kind of have different orientations towards what pop and youth culture and consumer culture is. The Frankfurt School sees it entirely repressive and commercial, where the Birmingham School kind of says, okay, mainstream pop and youth and consumer culture is repressive and commercial, but these kind of more subcultural youth cultures actually are ways for some people to rebel and subvert dominant norms. So ways of kind of, finding a place to be yourself in this kind of, dominance and ideology. The Frankfurt School, the Birmingham School, just as a reminder here, they kind of argued that there was kind of things such as positive mass consumption, a politics of pleasure, and in things like, choosing to be a mod or choosing to be a rocker or choosing to be a riot girl or whatever, there's elements of resistance to dominant norms. So this Birmingham School began in the late 60s, went through to early 70s when it was late 70s when it was particularly influential. And they did all these really interesting ethnographic studies of these particular subcultures. And quite importantly, many of the people were kind of insiders. They were part of the subcultures themselves, which in many ways you would see as a kind of form of research bias, but it's also a way of capturing the inner workings and understandings of a particular form of subculture that people that are outsiders can't really kind of see or understand. So the Birmingham School have a much more positive attitude towards pop culture and youth culture and things like that than the Frankfurt School. They see there's kind of, areas of relative autonomy going on in these spaces where you can, pick and choose things from pop culture to express yourself, and subvert some of the dominant norms. So this very much sees popular culture and the kind of practices that young people do within it as a site of struggle. Resistance here is through symbols and rituals, through cultural mixing and bricolage that we've outlined earlier in the course. Importantly here, against the Frankfurt School, and the idea that kind of the culture industry is nothing but repression, this provides ways of people to live that don't necessarily challenge the system as a whole, but allow a kind of creation of of meaning to live within it. Again, bricolage is a way of kind of using everyday things in a different way to kind of have some form of self-expression. So pop culture here, and the way that young people practice it, is a contested site for political constructions of the people. So in this way, it's important to think about pop culture and youth culture as much a site of practice, of doing stuff, as a much of kind of consumption, just kind of, receiving stuff and using things. And it's important kind of distinction to make. It allows then, participation in popular culture things, making music, going to gigs, this kind of stuff, as a way of expression of self rather than just a kind of way of other people providing you with, pseudo-individualization. Okay, I'll leave that there and then I'll come back and talk about youth transitions.